All right, my AP language brothers and sisters, Kristian Kuhn coming at you again, affectionately known as the Bob Ross of composition. And I have a practice FRQ3 for this particular writing workshop. And I've stated in the Facebook groups a couple of times the following. There's a correlation in my classroom, and it goes like this. The more I recycle former exams, the more plagiarized, copied work I get. So I've gotten into the tendency of creating my own material, and it really precludes kids from using the ChatGPTs and just hijacking essays that are abundantly prevalent all over the interwebs. So what I did for this was it was a exam prep assignment. I gave students 40 minutes to crank this one out. And what you're going to see in this writing workshop video are some of the better exemplars that my students wrote. So teachers, you can use this as kind of a teaching tool for your students, and you can get a sense of how my students manipulate and pull the strings of my heuristics, the declarative and the inverted thesis, and then the syllogistic body paragraphs. Before we dive in, please subscribe. The channel's called Kristian Kuhn, the Bob Ross of composition. Tell your friends, tell your colleagues, tell your students, spread the word far and wide, and let us grow. So I got a prompt for us. And as you saw on that first slide, I got a quote from Harland Sanders. So I thought this was really interesting. Sometimes I like to imagine that I'm the college board and I have like total authority to make prompts. And I doubt that the college board would ever choose a Harland Sanders quote. But I was like, why not? Let's go for it. So here's the prompt. In a 1978 interview at the age of 88, Colonel Harland Sanders made the following statement. Just because you took longer than others doesn't mean you failed. I started KFC at 65. It encapsulates Colonel Sanders' remarkable journey and serves as an inspiration to those who may feel discouraged by their age, and then this word's very important, or the perception of failure. After facing numerous setbacks and failures throughout his life, Colonel Sanders found success in his latter years. He became a billionaire at the age of 88. Write an essay in which you explore the nature of his claim. So it's very similar to the flavor of several other FRQs in years past. And what I have my students do is kind of unpack the diction of this, unpack the prompt, and we'll talk about that in just a second. So we got to ask ourselves the question out of the gate. Kids are looking at a blank screen. They're looking at a blank sheet of paper. Intuitively, instinctively, they ask, so how do I write the intro? And I got two approaches to this. They can either declare it or invert it. And I'll break the verbiage of that down in just a second and have some exemplars for you that students wrote. So the big thing is that they have to unpack the key diction. And in that prompt, the quote is very simple. Just because you took longer, so that's important, than others, doesn't mean you failed. That's an important word. I started KFC at 65. And then in the prompt, I highlighted it as I read it. The or is really important, or the perception of failure. So kids don't need to talk about age in particular. They're talking about that perception of failure. So I tell my students to do all the pre-planning in their heads before they place pen to paper. So unpacking the key diction is key. And we know that that key diction is going to anchor the thesis. The next step that I have my students do is set their GPS. I think it's really important before students write this particular essay that they know what they're going to use for their textual support. So I have on this slide some of the people, places, things that students used in their body paragraphs here. And you can see I got a wide array of things that worked perfectly well. And when we get into the body paragraphs, I'll show you a couple. So I guess another big thing here is that the reason why my students are, I think they're doing pretty well. My kids are really prepared this year. I have an excellent group of kids. And ever since I got them the day after Labor Day, I've Bob Rossed my instruction. What does that mean? Well, I don't merely assign writing, I explicitly teach it. I write in front of my students with and for them. So I get to the proverbial easel and canvas. And just like Bob Ross, I use heuristics. And I know in the AP world, a lot of teachers use templates. Heuristics are a little different, and you'll see that in just a second. And Bob Ross used heuristics as well. He used something called the wet on wet technique. So every time he or one of his students approached a natural landscape, boom, wet on wet technique. And the same goes for my students, no matter which FRQ they're doing, whether it be for Lang, Lit, even the on-level classes, you can always declare or invert the thesis. And then every single body paragraph can be written syllogistically. And I just model until they're all good. And the exemplars that you're going to see here, I did not model for. So we're like, 3 weeks before the exam. And so I got to cut them loose and cut the cord. So let's talk about what the declarative thesis is. So when you declare the thesis, you begin with the thesis. So heavy focus on the verbiage of the prompt, and you get anchored in there. In terms of the context and background, I call it the seeds to the line of reasoning. And I like it when my kids kind of hint or set the GPS for the direction of the body paragraphs. Who or what are you going to be writing about, right? Kind of front load that a little bit. I also want to see some tier 2 level vocabulary, just your average run-of-the-mill SAT level caliber words. And then many of you that follow my channel know that I'm a real stickler about sentence constructs, and I use the seminal text Write It Right by Strunk and White and really hone in on their rule number 18. The idea that there are 12 sentence types and that you can pattern them 20 different ways. So just for, curiosity, check out what my students are doing at sentence level in terms of, I want them to be syntactical ninjas come time of the exam. So they're doing some interesting things with their patterning in the hopes of achieving voice, rhythm, and flow. And then you as teacher, figure out if my students would be in contention for the sophistication point. Because I think it's a combination of, wielding the heuristic, copying a certain level of diction, but also wielding those sentence constructs so that you have really, really good pizzazz and flair at sentence level. I think that puts kids in contention for the sophistication point more than anything else. But of course, you need, specificity with the textual support in the body paragraphs as well. So you can flip this and go the inverted route. And what you're going to see in my student exemplars is that most of my kids go the inverted route. Like 99 out of 100 times they go the inverted route, which just means you end with the thesis. It's still going to be 4 sentences long. So every intro my students write four sentences, and the same ingredients go in there. Focus on the tier 2, but stay in your wheelhouse. Sound natural, don't sound contrived. Cook up those sentence constructs and then set the GPS. Where are the body paragraphs going? So that might be a little pie in the sky and nebulous. So let's see some exemplars. I think I got 4 of them for you to help demystify it. So this is inverted, and I'll read it through and then I'll unpack it for you. The children's fable, The Tortoise and the Hare, is not just a story that exists in a bedtime story vacuum, but it serves as a reminder that time, as a measurement of personal growth and achievement, is in fact an abstract. Along the journey of life, there will be setbacks. This is inevitable. But at the core of one's disposition and sense of character is the internal clockwork that frames how one reacts to these seeming failures. Michael Jordan, as well as the most famous rock band of all time, the Beatles, serve as 2 perfect examples of the necessary mindsets one must have if success is to remain the ultimate goal. So one of the things that I teach is that lead through hook and analogy, right? So the paper is not going to be about the tortoise and the hare. They're just using it as an analogy to unpack the verbiage of the prompts. And you can see manifest in these 4 sentences a lot of synonyms, approximations, or direct language from the prompt. So it's really important that the thesis use that language. In terms of sentence constructs, just let me draw your attention to that first sentence. Students need to have some kind of complexity at sentence level on occasion. You don't want to overdo it. So look how they lead with that sentence. It's nice, flowing, good wielded sentence. And then look at the next one. Boom, simple. And it's got that parenthetical. And then the third is different from the fourth. One of the things I emphasize with my students is this. Don't parallel your syntax. You got to pay attention to the sentence you just dropped and create a different pattern after that. Otherwise, you're going to create a da-dot, 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 da-dot kind of voice rhythm flow. And you don't want that. So there's no way you're going to get the sophistication point if you're writing like that. Also note in this one, the vocabulary's up there, but it's all controlled, right? The kid possesses these words and they own them, right? So oftentimes when I ask kids to stretch, they get out of their wheelhouse a little bit. They break their lane and they invent words or misuse words, or they're out of their vocal range. So the idea is, not to use $1 million words and say, hey, I did good writing, right? You have to own the words and make sure that you can use them properly. So this one I think is perfectly done. 4 sentences, inverted. Thesis point is definitely there. And then you can also see the seeds for the line of reasoning. They're going to have a body paragraph about Michael Jordan and a body paragraph about the Beatles. And that's the kicker with this too. You're going to see my students only do 4 paragraphs for this: intro, 2 bodies, and a conclusion. And that seems to bode well. I've taught the course for over 20 years, and my students have always written 4 paragraphs for all 3 FRQs. And I know some teachers are really wedded to the idea that it has to be a 5-paragraph essay, and that's a myth. It's not true. So let's do it again just to really shore up how to do it. And I'll read it through, and then you can see what's at play here. Failure and adversity are unavoidable steps of making it to one's goal. For some, the obstacles presented are harder, last longer, and prolong success, making the idea of it further from reach. When presented with numerous barriers, some give up or say it's impossible, especially later in life or later than others. Those who push through are those who obtain real success. As Colonel Sanders said, the idea that success can be reached despite doing it later than everyone else is possible. This can be seen clearly in sports. So again, you have an inverted thesis. The last sentence, the 4th sentence, posits the argument of the piece. In terms of, the context and background and the GPS for where we're going to go in the body paragraphs, the student's going to give 2 sports examples. And we talked about this as a class. I like to see a variety of sources. I think like double hit in sports can be a little redundant, and it lacks complexity. It shows like a limitation of the student's vision. So we tweak this. And I think this student went with a sports example and then a literature or pop cultural example. But in terms of sentence constructs, they're doing the exact same thing as the first one. The vocab's not as advanced. The sentence constructs are not as advanced, but it's still really doing good work. And out of the gate, they're off to blazing speed. So it's a well-established thesis, perfectly organized introductory paragraph, and it's doing what it needs to do. This is really, really good. And I think in the land of AP, sometimes readers will read an intro and say, this paper's headed towards a 3, or wow, this paper's headed towards a 6. And I think this is clearly a 5. Some might give it a 6. Very well done and very well organized. Let's paint one more and just really see how it is done. And you can see here, just in reading the first sentence, that this student is going to declare. They named their, GPS directions in the first sentence. As a class, we talked about this. And students said, I kind of like the flow and the rhythm of the inverted a little better. It's less abrupt, less direct. It's more nuanced. And I don't really care which way my kids go. The main thing is to get the thesis, have intentionality, give it direction, and rock and roll from there. So here it is. Well, Malala Yousafzai and J.K. Rowling are often celebrated for their remarkable success. A closer examination reveals that both women have experienced significant failures in their lives. Yousafzai, the Nobel laureate and advocate for girls' education, faced the failure of the Taliban's attempt to silence her, while Rowling, the renowned author of the Harry Potter series, encountered rejection from multiple publishers before finding success. These failures not only shaped their journeys, but also served as stepping stones towards their eventual triumphs, illustrating the resilience and determination that propelled them to become influential figures in their respective fields. Even though it's declarative, it's doing the same thing, right? You got your GPS, you got the seeds for the line of reasoning. Sentence constructs are all varied. Student is, wielding some decent vocab. And they've absolutely hammered a thesis. So I'm going to leave that to teacher preference, right? So I usually tell my kids to go inverted. I like it a little better than the declarative, but it gets the job done. And, there's nothing, absolutely lacking in this one as well. It's playing with the verbiage and the parlance of the quote by Colonel Sanders, and that's what ultimately arrives at a pretty good, concrete, articulate thesis statement. To shore it up, let's take a look at one more. This one goes back to inverted. From birth, everyone feels that pressing tick-tock sound of the clock telling them that time is running out. Anxiety for tomorrow rings an indelible alarm in the minds of many. But whether the battle against doomsday is amongst others or a battle of you is immaterial, for life is not a Grand Prix or even a race. The truth is this: we may not have all the time in the world, but we do have today. And while failure is inevitable, it need not cripple one from pursuing their dreams. Success knows no age or limit, as proved by the likes of French sculptor Camille Claudel and composer Felix Mendelssohn. So very good, right? So each one is doing, pretty much the same thing. And what separates them is just minor, gradations. And again, I think it comes down, to the tier 2, the sentence constructs, and just the ease and the flow and the rhythm of the voice. Like, this kid has excellent control. I like the playfulness of the language up top. I think it's really, really well done. And out of the gate, they're off to a splendid start. So intros are done. We have to ask ourselves this: so how do I construct the bodies? And I got a little speech bubble there. When we talk about the second premise, I'm going to utter this mantra over and over and over again. Specificity, get specific. So as I alluded to, my students use something called the syllogistic method for all of their body paragraphs, right? It's a heuristic that's rooted in the Aristotelian tradition. Aristotle thunked it up. He ran a school called the Lyceum, and the townsboys would go there to learn about oration, polemics, debate, wordsmithing, word wrangling. And, there's a seminal text called Plato's Republic in which the philosophers and the scholars grapple with a juicy essential question: what is justice? And Aristotle, like us composition teachers, noted, like, some of my students can really, structure their arguments nice, cogently, great lines of reasoning. They're articulate. They're like perfectly executed. Why is that? So he opened up the lid of his better scholars, and he had a eureka moment. He said, aha, I got it. These students have like a mathematical, computative approach to their argument. And he said, I'm going to call it a syllogism. And all it is, it's like math, where you go from premise 1, premise 2 to conclusion. So imagine the following instance. If I were to say premise 1, arsenic is deadly, you all would say, yep, Kristian, you are 100% correct. But if I followed up with premise 2 and say, my dog ate arsenic, and I give you some context, like, yeah, I got some rats in my house. I put some arsenic beneath my kitchen sink. And this morning, my dog Skipper was beneath the sink, and he came out, and he had white stuff all over his muzzle and his grizzle. You're naturally going to conclude, deduce, logically, uh-oh, Kristian, that's not going to bode well for your dog. Your dog's going to die, right? And when our students write, we want them to be that cogent. We want tight lines of reasoning as they proceed through their arguments. So how do we morph Aristotle's heuristic and make it our own heuristic for the purposes of doing FRQ3? Here's the kicker. First premise is going to be an argument containing the verbiage of the prompt, right? You got to articulate a why reason. And those that are familiar with my approach to synthesis, this is the exact same thing. We're going to literally write this the exact same way. So there's some math to this. I want the first premise to be 3 sentences long. So the old synthesis prompts used to say over and over and over again, you must keep your argument central. And I think it's a good rule. It's a good compositional rule. The task is to write an argument. So if you're slipping your textual support up in 1, 2, 3, you're kind of lose the centrality of the argument, and it's going to sound very summative. So 3 sentences is like the perfect sweet spot to get anchored in that argument and articulate it exactly. So the 4th sentence begins with the second premise. And this is where you're going to talk about, the figures, the characters, the peoples, the places, the things that are mentioned in the introductory paragraph. And in parentheses there, I say specificity, right? I really think kids need to be specific with this. And then the other thing is body paragraphs need to be concluded. And this is where we're going to link and echo all the way back to the prompt and the thesis. One last piece of math, a syllogistic body paragraph takes about 10 to 12 sentences. And this is why we only do 4 paragraphs. Intro, 2 bodies, conclusion. In reading sample papers for years, I see a lot of kids write like 4-sentence, 5-sentence baggers for the body paragraphs. Quite frankly, there's just not enough support or analysis to really fully flesh out an argument. So I'm giving my kids more space to hammer their argument and prove their stance. So I think the next question is this. What's the first premise look like? What do these 3 sentences look like? So I got an example here. I'll read it to you and then I'll unpack it. Many individuals maintain the false notion that another's success is the result of a congenital predisposition. As such, one does not become great through their grit, determination, and even failures, but instead enter the world at birth destined to achieve some impossible goal. Not only is this perspective wrong, it overlooks the fact that one's success is deeply rooted in the inevitability of failure. So let's go back to the definition of a first premise. One of the things I said was you got to articulate a why reason, but you also need to use the parlance and the verbiage, the diction of the prompt. And I have synonyms, approximations, or exact verbiage from the prompt to get anchored in my argument here. And you can see it's 3 sentences. I'm still doing the same stuff that I was doing in the intro. So you can see some interesting sentence patterning here. And again, those that have looked at my 20 sentence pattern videos in YouTube, you can see that in this example, there's a trio in it, right? So you got grit, determination, failure. So students still need to be doing those duos, those trios, those quadruples. Vocab has to stay up. And that's how you're going to rip the voice, the rhythm, and the flow. So let's talk about the 4th sentence. Earlier I said 4th sentence is the transition into the second premise. So here's how a student might transition. Take, as an example, the life and legacy of the greatest basketball player of all time, Michael Jordan, as a teenager, and then you crank specificity. Right? You just let it rip as much as you know about Michael Jordan as it pertains and is germane to the prompt. So I wrote that first premise and I wrote this, lead into the second premise just to model how to do it. And then my students did it on their own. So let's take a look at 2 student sample syllogistic body paragraphs. This one comes from a good dookie in my class by the name of Miles. Shout out to him. So let's take a look here at his first 3 sentences, which comprise the first premise. Success and failure are 2 sides of the same coin. It is impossible to have one without the other. A trend often found in history is that those who faltered but stood up and trod forward accomplished the most. Failure, when managed properly, can be a stepping stone to something better. In fact, it is necessary for success. Same old stuff, right? So use the verbiage, use the diction of the prompt to anchor the why reason. That's really pivotal in a first premise. Cook the sentence constructs, keep the vocab up, be as articulate as possible. And this kid's doing fantastic. So let's see how he segues into the second premise, which again is you transition at the fourth sentence. Alexander Hamilton, the first Secretary of the Treasury, is one of the most renowned founding fathers in American history. However, his life was riddled with adversity and poor circumstances. Hailing from the Caribbean, he had a terrible childhood, destitute, abandoned, and bastardized. And to make it worse, his mother died, then his cousin committed suicide. Note the specificity here, right? Really good. And he's doing some cool things at sentence level as well. Even through it all, the orphan found a way to claw himself out of poverty. He became well versed in the art of economics and politics. Finally, he was able to embark on a journey to America, where he became an ardent patriot and revolutionist, eventually propelling himself to becoming one of America's most important political voices. Despite his boom in popularity, he had many failures too, such as his infidelity and his hot-headedness. Most importantly, however, was his tendency to anger the opposition, which culminated into a vicious rivalry between himself and Aaron Burr, ultimately leading to his death. So I'm out of space on this slide. Look where it continues. Ironically, Hamilton, the nation's foremost economic expert, even though he enjoyed public popularity for much of his adult life, never received the luxury of wealth, and when he died, his fame quickly dwindled. Mere decades later, the National Bank, perhaps Hamilton's greatest achievement, was destroyed when President Andrew Jackson vetoed its recharter. As the centuries flew by, Hamilton's legacy became more and more obfuscated until he was essentially forgotten by the masses and disregarded by the historians. However, hundreds of years after his death, the famous playwright Lin-Manuel Miranda found particular interest in his story. So we got plenty of support, plenty of analysis. Now let's take a look at the conclusion. This usually takes 2 or 3 sentences, and yet again, you got to use the verbiage and the parlance of the prompt in order to anchor it back full circle. Like syllogisms usually come full circle on themselves. After 7 years of trial and error with many successes and missteps, he revived the legacy of Hamilton. For the first time ever, Hamilton achieved the fame for which he had toiled his whole life. Even though he's long dead, he has never been so widely beloved, proving that success can come at the most unexpected times. And though we may never see it, our efforts will pay off. So Miles went a little over 12 sentences, but it's A-okay. I don't want kids to bloviate and prattle on and on and on and on. But if they break the rule just a tad bit, totally cool. The line of reasoning is most important. If it stays intact, it's okay to go a little bit over. So you can see there, you lead with that first premise, drop the parlance, drop the verbiage, drop the diction of the prompt, specificity of example as it pertains to the prompt, and then conclusion, wrap it all back, link and echo. So the question becomes, what do I do next? And it's very simple, and this is where the whole process gets demystified nicely for students. You just bust out another syllogism. It's a 4-paragraph essay. So you drop 2 seeds for the line of reasoning up top in that introductory paragraph. Just bust out another syllogism about that second seed. So we're going to take a look at a different student. This is Adriana. And she's the one that wrote the introduction about the sports. She was going to go sports for both directions. So let's see her first premise. Again, 3 sentences, use the language of the prompt, state the why reason. The societal notion that there are specific windows of opportunity when one can achieve success is a fallacy. Though with prolonged time and prominent obstacles, it may be more difficult to reach a goal. With hard work and dedication, one can overcome the odds. Like Colonel Sanders, many athletes in sports history have overcome obstacles like time to achieve their biggest dreams. So recall, fourth sentence, transition into the textual support. Take, for example, women's lacrosse star Charlotte North. For most, the best lacrosse players start young, as the fine motor skills to wield a lacrosse stick take hours of practice and years to master. However, North started at a later age than most, yet with the same goal, to play and dominate college lacrosse. Though she started at a disadvantage, she worked hard every year, night and day, perfecting her craft. Her heart and grit for the sport eventually landed her a spot on the Duke women's lacrosse team, where for 3 years she didn't stand out. She was average, but she still wanted to be the best. The next year, she worked tirelessly in hopes a school would take a chance on her. So you can see here, like my students are pretty good at this. I skill and drill it. You know, their syntax is very nice. They're able to have some syntactical flair and pop in their writing. Vocab's really good as well. So I do intensive word study academies and nuance academies. From day one, we hit the ground running on this. So most of my kids, you know, if they give me an iota of effort and attention, grow, you know, fairly exponentially over the course of the academic year and are able to do this. So her syllogism goes on. Boston College ended up offering her a spot, a player that, stat-wise, was no better than any player they already had. And I like that sentence, stat-wise, you know, just like break up the sentence. So we get into all that stuff with the sentence patterns. Her countless hours of training started to pay off, and she quickly became one of the most well-known players and was contested for one of the best in the world. She finished her second senior season with the leading amount of points in the NCAA, and she went on to play professionally, becoming the face of women's lacrosse. And just like Miles, Adriana is going to link back and echo, right? Though North started later, like Colonel Sanders, and didn't really make a name for herself until her senior year, she became the best player in the world solely based on her determination to get better. That's perfect, right? And it takes like 10 to 12 sentences to organize that. So my students basically, they just, write 2 syllogisms, switch up their examples, but use the pattern of the heuristic each time. We ain't done though. We got to wrap this essay up, right? We need a conclusion paragraph. And I'm going to make this quick. My students just do 3 to 4 sentences for the conclusion paragraph. And early in the academic year, I give them stems and give them the following analogy. So the conclusion paragraph of all the essays is sort of like a fireworks display grand finale. Big theme, big exigence, big moral of the story. So these all encapsulating clauses, like front-loaded clauses, such as simply said, evidentially, in no other words, when it's all said and done, at the end of the day, get them to that picture. And again, just 3 or 4 sentences. So that's it for this FRQ3 practice. Happy teaching, happy writing. If you have any questions or want to reach out, I got an email address, which is teachingwritingcoach@gmail.com. Also note, I got a webpage, www.teachinghowtowrite.com. So I'm a lead teacher for a national writing project. I'm all over the place doing some work with applied practice, perfection learning, NCTE, a little work with the College Board. So I have webinars and professional development throughout the calendar year. So if you want to see what's offered, just go to www.teachinghowtowrite.com. Most of it's free. Some of it's for a nominal fee. And if you have any questions, just reach out. So that's it for now. Be well. Happy test prepping.